Thank you all for being here. Thank you to our speakers and our moderator. I know that all of you have dance cards that are full of Zoom events, and we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. Before we start, on behalf of Signal, and I'm sure I speak for all of you as well, in sending our condolences to the family and friends of Ambassador Du Wei, who passed away suddenly a couple of days ago in his residence in Israel. We extend our deepest regrets to the people of China. Ambassador Du Wei was very well thought of and considered an excellent diplomat. Today, we are fortunate to have an outstanding array of experts from around the world to address what is perhaps the most pressing geopolitical issue of our day, managing relations with the US and China in the wake of COVID-19. To moderate this roundtable, we are delighted to have former MK Ksenia Svetlova. So without further ado, Ksenia, I pass the mic over to you.
Thank you very much, Caris. Dear participants, dear distinguished speakers, I'm very happy to have this opportunity to welcome you all at Signal's Digital Roundtable Managing Relations with the US and China in the wake of COVID-19. May you live in an interesting times is actually not a Chinese, but an English expression that purports to be a translation of a traditional Chinese one. So despite not being an actual Chinese source, we live in a very interesting times and challenging times. Even before the COVID-19 crisis impended the world, US-China relations had entered a particularly mistrustful and combative period. In its 1917 National Security Strategy, Trump administration openly stated that great power competition was the defining feature of the age, and the constant contest with China was at the heart of US globalist strategy. The subject has become all the more sensitive due to the advent of the COVID-19 crisis, which has left many countries on the Silk Road's route between East Asia, Middle East, and Africa even weaker economically, with growing deficits, crippled trade, employment, ballooning national debt, and lack of resources to invest in strategic infrastructure. So before China's-US relations was complicated before, and now it will definitely define global affairs for the foreseeable future. It's likely that the US administration will exercise more pressure on Israel and other foreign allies as time will pass. Post-coronavirus crisis, how will countries, and particularly us, the US allies, deal with what is already a difficult balance between the rising power of China and existing US power? Before passing the mic to our first speaker, let me just walk you through some ground rules of our discussion now. So each speaker will have 5 minutes for introduction. Please try to stick to 5 minutes so we can leave as many time as possible for discussion, because it's not a seminar, it's a round table, and your questions are very welcome. Your mics are muted now, and I will unmute you when it's your time to speak, the speakers, and when you will be asking questions. Regarding the questions, you may send us your questions and remarks in the general chat. Please try to address them to a specific speaker, and also please keep it short as much as possible. You may also press the raise your hand button. You will need to press the participant list and find this option on the right side at the bottom. So now, without further ado, allow me to present our first speaker, an Honorable Mr. Dale Aluf, psychologist, political researcher, and analyst, as Signal's Director of Research and Strategy. Please, Dale, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ksenia. Greetings, everybody, and welcome. This event is actually a continuation of a project that we launched in 2018, where we set out to understand how other countries view China's foreign policy and how they conduct relations with Beijing. The purpose was to glean insights that can help Israel develop a more effective policy for dealing with China. At the time, we selected 5 case studies: Australia, Chile, the Netherlands, Singapore, and Switzerland. Of course, we needed to find a conceptual framework to make sense of these interactions. At first, we looked at the idea of large, small, and medium-sized countries, but quickly realized that this was problematic. If we look at Israel, for example, Israel is a relatively small country in terms of geography, with a population half the size of Beijing, but still has a powerful military, vibrant innovation ecosystem, and a strong economy. In light of this, we turned our attention instead to the asymmetries that exist within the relationships and examined the strategies that countries use to manage these asymmetries, which exist across finance, energy, soft power, and trade. This is really important because countries use their asymmetric advantages to achieve their national interests. One of the best examples, perhaps, is how America utilizes their dominance of the financial system in the form of sanctions to enforce compliance. Essentially, these power asymmetries afford countries leverage, and thus the things which connect us have also become points of vulnerability. The current pandemic has revealed the vast asymmetry in terms of manufacturing and production, illuminating our dependence on China for things like pharmaceuticals. But in relation to most countries, there exists a variety of asymmetries. Take, for example, Chile. Chile's economy is largely dependent on copper exports, of which China purchased roughly 75%. This means that if China stops buying copper, Chile is in trouble. Chile understands this and has thus established a $14 billion stabilization fund to counterbalance this asymmetry. But the world is not comprised of isolated bilateral relationships, and that's exactly why we're here today. Tensions between the United States and China have further complicated the matter, as countries now need to manage the asymmetries between two rival powers with alternate strategic perceptions, while at the same time attempting to maintain cordial relations with both. So in 2011, Beijing was very displeased to find out that the US announced that they were deploying Marines to Darwin, Australia. And 4 years later, Australia was criticized by the US after awarding Chinese-owned land bridge the tender to operate the Darwin port for 99 years. While most countries have voiced that they don't wish to choose sides, really, Australia has already aligned itself firmly with the US. Australia had banned Huawei from its 5G infrastructure even before the US applied pressure. And more recently, after a call with Donald Trump, Scott Morrison launched an investigation into China's initial handling of the coronavirus. As expected, China's ministry responded by cautioning Canberra that if it goes ahead with the investigation, then Chinese demand for Australian goods may well decline. So today we're here to learn how countries plan to navigate this complex new reality they find themselves in. I hope that the asymmetry theory will help to better contextualize our discussion. Thank you very much for listening, and Ksenia, back to you.
Wow, Dale, ahead of your time, and thank you so much for being very precise and for this very brief and interesting introduction. So our next speaker is Professor Kerry Brown, who is a professor of Chinese studies and director of the Lao China Institute at King's College London. Professor Brown, the floor is yours, please.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this event. In fact, I think it was only maybe a year, a bit more than a year ago, that I was in Israel at your kind invitation, maybe 18 months. So I hope that at some point we can all meet again physically when our various lockdowns are finished. So I'll tell you a bit about the UK experience regarding China recently, which has been quite interesting. I'll talk briefly about three things: blame, sentiment, alliances, and then a policy quandary around the economy. So in terms of blame, I guess because the impact of the coronavirus in the UK has been huge, over 44,000 fatalities as of today, there has been significant pressure on politicians. And where they once in January were really kind of looking at this as like a SARS-2, you know, the issue in China 20 years ago, which was largely an Asian problem, particularly a Greater China problem. Today, this has become a European and in particular a UK problem. And the response of the government on the whole has been pretty poor. And so the kind of interesting to see how politicians, because of their kind of diplomatic pressure, the democratic pressures that they need to be aware of public support and, you know, elections, they're very often kind of figuring China as a place that can be blamed. There are things, of course, about the whole COVID-19 that need accountability. But there are also, of course, things in which we need to be accountable as British to ourselves. And I think those lines have been pretty clearly blurred. The second, I suppose, that COVID-19 has been a big learning experience about sentiment. British sentiment towards China was different to Australia and the US, because I think it was always a bit of an unknown. China was remote, not really that part of our lives, not the biggest trading partner by far, not the biggest investor by far. That was Europe or the US, really kind of a more distant part of our lives. But of course, COVID-19 has made China come right into our lives in a very deep and intimate way. And British sentiment has, I think, become negative. So a recent opinion poll said that I think something like more than 80% of British people had a negative view of China, which is higher actually than even the kind of most negative of polls in the United States or Australia. This is just one poll. It might not be that representative, but I think it's ominous that the British sentiment has always been complacent, and now suddenly many British people have discovered this thing called China. Many politicians here have too, never really thought about it much before, and their initial thoughts are pretty negative. So there is an issue about where this is going to go. The third is alliances. The UK, of course, like Israel, is a very, very big ally of the United States. But at the moment, the United States obviously is in a very specific position, and its relationships with China seem to be deteriorating by the day. On issues like Huawei, the telecoms company, on issues like the role that China will play in British universities, this has been really politicized. And the kind of complexities it's brought to our alliances structure, particularly with the United States, is clearly going to get deeper and deeper and more of a problem. On Huawei, for instance, just as an example, but a very important and symbolic one, although Boris Johnson said, the Prime Minister in January, that Huawei would be able to work on the 5G network here, it is hard to see in the face of American opposition how that will really be operational. Huawei may rhetorically be welcome to come to the UK. In terms of actually doing stuff, I think it's going to be really, really hard to imagine that happening without either alienating the United States, which is impossible, or simply not having Huawei here. Very finally, there is the policy quandary. The UK is meant to leave the European Union common market, common economic, common sort of export zone, common kind of, I suppose you could call it tax zone, by the end of this year, by the 31st of December. And, you know, at the moment, the negotiations are not going well. So there's a likelihood, a strong likelihood, almost by the day getting stronger, that there will be no deal. In that situation, I suppose the assumption before COVID-19 was, well, the United States is a place where the UK could really develop a lot more business. But of course, if the United States economy is taking as big a hit as it looks likely to at the moment, and in view of the UK not having the easier access to Europe that it had, then one would assume that the UK, with a significant economic issue itself because of COVID, would then look at the world's second biggest economy, the one that it does the least with at the moment. As I said before, China's relationships with the UK economically are not huge. This is an area, presumably, that could be expanded. However, the political relationship at the moment, the sentiments towards China, the kind of blame going on, means it is difficult to see on the 1st of January next year how, if the UK is not able to have a different kind of trading relationship with America, if the UK has a no deal with the European Union, how it is really going to construct a positive relationship with China economically that is going to kind of fill even part of that very significant gap. And I, just as a final question, concluding, really don't know how it is possible to justify that when you are going to be facing, you know, the UK is going to be facing very, very serious economic challenges. In that situation, how is it possible that you are not able to construct something with China that you can say, in fact, that because of your sentiments and blame and everything, you're going to walk away from that? So that is, to me, a big unanswered question. And I think it's really worth the world watching what happens then, because it will show the limits of pragmatism and the idea that we have some kind of big, you know, ideological commitment that we can't deal with China. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Brown. The impossible choice, the perspective from the Great Britain. So we are going to our next speaker, and I'm very happy to introduce Professor Filippo Fassulo, who is the director of the Italy-China Foundation Center on Business Research and research fellow at ISPI. Filippo, the floor is yours, please.
Hi, I'm so happy for being here with you. There are so many friends who invited me and so many friends I can see among the people listening to us today. The question you are posing are very, very relevant, Mr. Chairman. And I think Italy is in a very particular position because Italy was at the center of a lot of debate about the relation with China in the last few years. I think what mainly characterized Italy's relation with China was a kind of double misunderstanding. A misunderstanding from Italian side on what would mean to sign an MOU with China, and a misunderstanding from the international side to what was the meaning for Italy to sign this agreement. What I'm saying, Italy's main reason to have a strong relationship with China is to expand its market. Even if right now China is only the number 9 destination for the export with 13 billion, while Germany is the first one, and France and the United States are in the top 3. And the Italian government had the idea, had the feeling that France and Germany relationship with China, their stronger relationship with China was the reason for their larger market opportunity there. So what happened at Italy between 2017 and 2018 tried to get a stronger relationship with China, but at that time the world was changing. So if till 2016, 17, and part of 18, having a good relation with China was in some way a good thing to have, in 2008, late 18 and early 19 was not the same point. So when Italy was in the position to sign the MOU with China, they were stuck in the middle of a changing world, of a changing relationship. But from Italian point of view, the MOU was nothing more than a political agreement with not very strong meaning. That was the Italian point of view. It was a misunderstanding from the Italian point of view. But, however, at the same time, the international community's opinion on that was a kind of misunderstanding too, because they thought Italy was passing from Western side to China side. It was never their goal. And in this kind of scenario, what happened with the mass diplomacy a few months ago was that Italy was the first country to be hit by COVID-19 after China. We had also Iran, but Italy was maybe one of among the biggest countries in the world after China to be hit. And we were among the first to receive Chinese donation. What happened there? It happened that maybe the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs was eager to get Chinese support for domestic political reasons. So he, since till mid-19, was the kingmaker of this government, but after that he get into the shadows. And so he thought he might get back to the center of political stage, being the one who was able to get masks and else thanks to his relationship with China. So this was the scenario, a scenario in which it was a double misunderstanding in Italy and in international community about this kind of relationship.
Thank you so very much, Filippo. Again, being very brief and living up to the very tight times that we allowed. So I would like to go now for Caris, who for the intervention what was said right now by the two distinguished speakers. Please, Caris.
Thank you very much, Ksenia. So what are the pressing challenges for Israel with respect to the China-US relationship? One critical issue that remains pressing is understanding China. Knowing Chinese history and culture, the more Israel becomes intertwined and involved with China, it's going to become more important to close that knowledge gap. It's significant that we understand how China sees things, because although we can find short-term gains in the China-Israel relationship, in order to have long-term benefits, having a keen understanding of China is central. Another area that is very important for Israel to take into consideration is China in the Middle East. Whereas the US presence is seemingly receding, China's is clearly growing across the region. It's building cities in Egypt. There are about $4 billion of deals in play in the UAE. China and Iran are cooperating on an energy deal in Syria, and China has troops on the ground in Syria, which are there on the one hand to keep an eye on the Uyghurs, but also to scout out infrastructure and construction projects for Chinese SOEs. So given Israel's regional security concerns, it may want to take a closer look at China in the Middle East. But the determining factor for Israel with regard to its relations with China has always been the US. The US is clearly Israel's closest strategic partner. And Pompeo's visit last week could indicate a recalibration of how we're going to have those relations going forward. Israel and the US see eye to eye on many things. But when it comes to China, Washington has a superpower perspective. And our perspective is very much that of a regional power with an export-oriented economy and a tremendous need for infrastructure upgrades that could value in the tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars. And China is the expert. China built the Carmel tunnels in the north of Israel. They're building the additional section of the port in Ashdod in the south of Israel. 4 Chinese companies are working together to build the most costly infrastructure project yet in Israel, which is the light rail in the center of the country. A Chinese company is bidding against an Israeli company to build and run the largest desalination plant in the world here in Israel. A Chinese company was part of the consortium that won the Alon Tavor power station tender. And Bright Food, which is a Chinese company that bought Tnuva, which is our largest dairy company. Well, now it's a Chinese company. They were part of the consortium that won the bid to build and establish a food tech incubator in the north of Israel. And of course, it's well known by many that a Chinese company is going to be running the port in Haifa for the next 25 years, starting next year. China is Israel's second largest trading partner, as it is for many countries. And in 2018, we sold $5 billion of goods to China. But it's important to remember, a lot of that was Intel Israel selling to Intel China. Israel's tech sector enjoys a lot of investment from China, and it enters through a variety of mechanisms. And Israeli and Chinese universities are doing joint research in many things, including nanotechnology. But I do want to stress that when it comes to Huawei, for Israel, it's relatively straightforward. There will not be any 5G Huawei equipment in Israel due to our special security requirements. That was never really an option. So overall, China is very pro-Israel when it comes to business, technology, academia, but politically, China has a 100% consistent record of voting against Israel in every single international forum. This did not, however, interfere with doing business together. What did was the trade war. As the trade war picked up speed, Israeli companies started to self-censor. They realized that if they are receiving money from China or are selling into China, US investment money and US markets may not be welcoming. So because the crossover seems to be less and less possible, they're deciding which of their services and goods will do better in which market. In general, we hear more and more about the US pressing allies to choose, pick a side. But Israel effectively has a side. There really is no choosing, and China knows it. So the challenge for Israel post-COVID is that we understand and address US concerns. And I think Doug Feith, the former US Undersecretary of Defense, said it well in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago, and I'm going to quote him. Neither Israel nor the US need to see China as an enemy or cease commerce with China. Both countries should see China clearly, and Israel should understand how US national security officials perceive China. And I would add, based on that, Israel should develop a plan that works for Israel, but also for the US. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caris. And if I may, I will just add a few sentences. A former MK who was sitting in the Committee for Foreign Affairs and Defense at the time, 2017, 2018, when there was quite a bit of pressure from the US on the future of relations with China, the approach among the heads of ministries, head of departments and the ministries was all or nothing, all or nothing. Either we should keep just things as they are and even expand without having any kind of tracing, you know, the activity of China without trying to centralize a knowledge about the activity of China, of Israel, or to not let it at all and to just succumb to any demand of the United States. And it does not necessarily needs to be this black or white approach, because things are usually more complicated in life than just having this black or white attitude. Okay, saying that, we are going, thanks for the Zoom capabilities that allow us to go from Israel directly to Brazil. And our next speaker, let me introduce her, Ms. Tatiana Rosito, is a senior fellow at the Brazilian Center for International Relations, where she coordinates the China Analysis Group under the Asia program. She's a diplomat and economist.
Ela está me apresentando. Sorry.
She's a diplomat and economist, having worked and lived over 10 years in Asia, where she served at the embassies of Brazil in Beijing and Singapore. Ms. Rosito, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nissa. Thank you also, Caris, for this invitation. Good evening to all. It's a pleasure to take part in this webinar on behalf of SEBRE, the Brazilian Center for International Relations, although I'm speaking in my personal capacity. I have, and for the sake of time, I will go straight to the main points in my initial remarks, the main points raised by the organizers, which are namely the most pressing challenges for Brazil vis-a-vis China-US tensions and how we could navigate on that. What are the areas of greatest importance to Brazil regarding China and US on the other hand, and how this expected influence or choice between these two sides will play. First of all, both US and China are very important partners for Brazil. But I would say in the last 10 to 15 years, the relationship has taken a dramatic transformation, especially between the economic links between Brazil and these two partners. Since 2009, China has been Brazil's largest export destination market. And today, for every dollar that we export to the US, we export 3 to China. So that is the amount of change. I also have some data to support this view. So today, China, in the first quarter of 2020, China has absorbed 31% of Brazilian exports, coming from around 27% in the same period last year. As for agricultural exports, China absorbed 38% of Brazil's agribusiness exports also in the first quarter, which is an increase of 26% since last year. This means that agricultural exports to China surpass our agricultural exports to the 9th next individual partners, including EU, US, and Japan. And agricultural exports for Brazil account for 46% of our total exports. I would say also in terms of investment, US has been traditional, and it is still probably the largest investor in stock, but the stock of FDI in Brazil now from China is around from 65 to 70 billion, according to estimates, which is also of the same order of magnitude of investment, the stock of investment from the US. China has an enormous amount of investments, especially in the energy sector, both in the electric sector mainly, and also in oil. Most of these resources, and this also accounts not only investments, but also the participation in different concession projects. I would say that that in economic terms has been what has really led the relationship, but it has also actually reflected a high degree of mutual political understanding, a coincidence of bilateral mutual interests, some also not only the complementarities in economic terms, but also very convergent views in terms of the importance of increasing the role of developing countries in multilateral institutions, especially international financial organizations. I think this has been clearly reflected in the creation of BRICS in 2009. And finally, in terms of the framework, Brazil has established a strategic partnership with China back in 1993. And we have, let's say, upgraded this partnership to a global strategic partnership in 2012. Within the same period, the relationship with the US, which has been traditionally our also a largest partner, I would say that it has lost some of its luster in the same period. Of course, it remained, full-fledged relationship, very robust bilateral economic relationship, including the important financial channels, but also people-to-people, academic, scientific, and technology. US as the largest also democracy in the Americas has always been a reference for us in terms of political values. I would say that this has been the full potential of this relationship, though, has been, let's say, lagging behind, even though it has different nuances in different governments in Brazil in the last decades. So it has been a strong amicable relationship, but probably lagging behind its full potential. At the same time that the relationship with China was booming. Well, this has changed very much in the last, since 2009, with the ascent of President Jair Bolsonaro to power in Brazil. He has re-energized the partnership with the US, not least with a very close relationship to President Trump. Also, Brazil, some elements of this new, let's say, relationship is that Brazil has been designated as a major non-NATO ally. We have also signed with the US the technology safeguards agreement, which had been in negotiation for a long time. We have enhanced or claimed to be part of the OECD, and also there were new advances in science and technology cooperation, among others. Meanwhile, well, things also continue to develop with China within our constructive framework. So President Jair Bolsonaro visited Beijing last year in October for a bilateral meeting. President Xi Jinping came to Brazil in November. And this somewhat, which had already started maybe in May 2009, when our vice president went to China to take part in the high-level meeting.
Diana, 1 minute. Sorry to interrupt you.
Thank you. Yeah, this highlighted, I mean, the fact that we were nurturing a very pragmatic and amicable relationship also with China, not probably with the same tones and political tones as before, but sort of this helped mitigate some of the fears like that were that arise during the campaign. In 2018. So where do we stand? I think one of the most important episodes for this, for Brazil, will be the confirmation that we'll have no restrictions for the 5G bid that is to take place still this year. We see in Brazil this as a sort of a litmus test for that. Because if we come up to the moment, it's important to say that there are no indications whatsoever from government agencies that we would have restrictions, right? But this would actually shed light on this issue. And if we were to adopt restrictions, then it could have, I think, a deteriorating effect for the relationships. And to conclude, I would say that for a middle regional power like Brazil, it has always been very important to emphasize our policy space and our capacity to claim our national interest and to have the policy space, including in the multilateral arena, to do that. It has been a tradition also for Brazil since the 19th century to try to extract this sort of benefits from difficult strategic conjunctures. And I hope we can continue to do that. We have, of course, very different
I'm so sorry,
trends.
Tatiana, but you need to wrap it up. Yes, our time is
Yeah,
up.
I'll do that. Thank you very much. So in the short term, I don't see much risks for the trade flows in the very short term. But one important issue, it will of course all depend on the answers of both sides. And I would hope I could talk later about the agreement, the trade agreement between US and China, which is bound to have a great effect in Brazil if implemented. And I'll stop here for the sake of time. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Tatiana. I am sure we will have a lot of questions for you also on the issue of the trade agreements. And of course, we cannot overlook the massive full-scale media wars, China-Brazil, that are happening right now as we speak. We are going to our last but not least speaker, Mr. Andrew Small, who is a senior transatlantic fellow with the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and a non-resident senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Please, Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Is the audio coming through okay? Yeah, okay. Well, I was asked to...
Your connection is not so good. Maybe try to...
Is the sound coming through?
You have to maybe change, if the earpiece is working.
Is the audio coming through now?
Yes, please go.
Okay. Okay. Well, thanks for the chance to join this discussion. I was asked to cover the German angle on this, which, despite my location in Washington, D.C. and nationality, I was very happy to do. As we saw yesterday with the Franco-German recovery plan announcement, it is pretty much impossible to talk about the German position without touching on the European one as well, though all the more so since we're about to head into the German presidency of the EU for the second half of the year. So I'm going to touch on that too. I think I also see on the line Gudrun Wacker, who is Germany's leading China expert, who can also fill in all the things that I have missed in these 5 minutes. So I think the old story for Germany was US as the security ally and still critical economic partner, China as the big new economic opportunity, and really the biggest source of growth for a number of critical German industries, cars, of course, but also petrochemicals, specialist engineering goods, and so on. The German public has always been more critical on human rights issues than many in Europe, but that didn't prevent a kind of special relationship of sorts developing between Berlin and Beijing, within which these issues were managed, and Germany was really the one big country in Europe to run a surplus with China as well. Then in the last couple of years, we've seen kind of quite a sharp shift on both counts. Germany has, of course, been kind of target number one in Europe for the Trump administration, whether that's on the trade front with actual or threatened tariffs, in the level of hostility expressed in public criticism. But really, I think the overall sense that the Trump approach has been kind of antithetical to the entire German perception of kind of multilateral, compromise-based, historically informed policymaking. But simultaneously, I think there's been a big shift in German industry as well, from China being seen as almost entirely an opportunity where some of the concerns that were there could be accepted or written off, to being seen much more actively as well as a competitor or rival. Whether that's in acquiring German technologies, competing in advanced industrial sectors, as we've seen with the Made in China 2025 strategy, or squeezing German companies out of third markets through the Belt and Road Initiative. And this concept that I think a number of people in this call will have heard of, systemic rivalry, that we've heard from the European side and from the EU, this concept, the systemic element of it, actually originated in a paper from the German Industry Association, the BDI. And strikingly, for me, the analysis of this kind of shift in perceptions of the risks emanating from China was not driven by kind of China hawks or hostile voices. It was really driven by a number of the people and a number of the companies that have been closest to China, most closely involved historically with China, and I think had the best sense actually of the kinds of changes that they were seeing unfolding under Xi Jinping. In the course of this rethink on Germany's approach to China, it was also very clear that almost nothing could be done at a German level alone, with the possible exception of some of the toughening up of investment screening. Almost all the major policy shifts that would be required to deal with some of the issues and concerns would need to take place at an EU level. So German officials, policymakers, business people have been among those who've been most active in pushing the kind of broader rethink that we've seen in Europe in the last couple of years on a whole series of issues relating to China and really Europe's wider strategic agenda as driven by some of these concerns about China: industrial policy, trade policy, competition policy, data policy, and many other areas. And you saw all of this laid out in this paper last year, the EU Strategic Outlook paper that described China as a partner, competitor, and also rival, systemic rival. This has all gone on without immediate reference to the shifts that we've seen in US-China policy. It's certainly clear that the US strategic shifts have opened up more space for Germany and for Europe as a whole to rethink its approach. But I think a lot of the shifts that we've seen have really been driven by Germany's own concerns. On issues such as technology access, investment, trade. A lot of the German concerns have not been so different from those that we've heard from the US. All the obvious critiques of the US approach are there in Germany. The approach to China is not multilateral enough, doesn't take partners into account, it ignores what I think is still seen as important strands of cooperation with China that are still necessary. It's too openly confrontational, all of these things that we've heard and are familiar with. But actually in a number of areas there has been quiet cooperation and coordination between Washington and Berlin on China-related questions, even in the middle of all the other issues that we've seen during the Trump administration and the tensions that have been with Berlin. The big exception to that has really been the 5G case, where the German government had not reached a position that was able to straddle the interests of the two sides, or really a well-consolidated position in Europe either. It's come under significant pressure and has made this extremely painful, contorted attempt to try to placate both the Chinese side and the US side, essentially to no avail. It's really been made a litmus test by both Washington and Beijing. There have been retaliatory threats directed at German industry from the Chinese side, and huge scrutiny and bilateral traffic from Washington, which has really made, in the whole list of 5G cases, the German case and the UK case have really been seen as the two critical ones here. But in the end, actually, what we've seen from the German Bundestag is momentum emerging from outside the German government, including from within the Chancellor's own party, to reach a kind of more European-minded solution on security, privacy, industrial policy concerns, which, of course, in the 5G case means a choice in favor of European companies, but that it's been motivated by a kind of an analysis driven by these factors rather than just a kind of US motivated push, though the final resolution to this is still not there and will be resolved in the weeks ahead. Very briefly, to sort of wrap up, the pandemic has had an impact on a few fronts, aside from the kind of delays and cancellations of summits that were supposed to happen this year and some of the negotiations that were supposed to take place between Europe and China. I think really China's behavior through the pandemic has shredded the view that we had seen consolidated after the financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis, that Beijing is a reliable, pragmatic actor during crises, and that its interests are sort of pragmatically attuned to a kind of concern to hold the global system together. The propaganda that we've seen, the disinformation, the economic threats, the level of ideological confrontation, the willingness to threaten suspension of medical supplies, and so on, has really had an effect. And I think it's really magnified the concerns that were already there about economic dependence, supply chain risks, and so on. I think the bigger geopolitical stock taking will have to wait until after the US elections. But as we saw from the announcement by Macron and Merkel yesterday, even the European recovery plans are going to have this kind of additional focus on the sovereignty and autonomy agenda for Europe, most of which has China very much in mind, including on supply chains. There will certainly be immediate needs for companies that need a short-term boost from one of the only markets in the world that's actually recovering. And there's clearly going to be an important cooperation agenda on issues such as climate. But I think there is a big rebalancing of priorities and views on China in Germany and Europe that's going to have some long-term effects.
Thank you so very much, Andrew. And I would like to thank to all of our speakers for wonderful presentations and also to keep it in time. So I would like to now open the floor for your questions. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. You have this opportunity when you touch the participant option on your screen, and you will see on the bottom on the right, you will have the opportunity to raise your hand and ask a question. So when you will raise your hand, you will be unmuted, and please then introduce yourself and direct your question to one of the speakers or to all of the speakers. Meanwhile, Dale, I would like for you to perhaps address some of the questions that you have to our distinguished speakers on the issues that we just discussed right now. And after that, I will perhaps use also my right as a moderator to address some of them towards one of the speakers. Please. Dale?
Hi. So I have firstly, thank you so much for those fascinating presentations. It was really, really great to hear all of that. I have a question for Kerry that relates to essentially Brexit, because well, we just heard that it's impossible to take on China without the EU. This is something that you know, for Germany, and it's something that I've read in the Netherlands strategy towards China. They're saying the same thing, that EU unity and engaging China is super important. I want to hear from Kerry what he thinks of that in terms of Brexit. Do you think that being out of the EU or less connected in a sense to the EU is going to affect Britain's ability to navigate the relationship, or do you think that it actually has given them more room to maneuver?
Well, I mean, in the past, certainly it was true for more difficult parts of the dialogue on human rights and more sort of broadly geopolitical issues, that a lot of stuff was done via Brussels. And I think what we see now is this curious situation in the UK of, on the one hand, you know, what us doing things bilaterally that were once done via Brussels, which can be very, very challenging. So in fact, the UK now has to have a policy on China, and it wasn't always the case. It would usually be outsourced up to a point, but you know, which kind of is quite exposing. But on the other hand, you see a lot of politicians in Britain who are really criticizing and attacking China. The Conservative Party has a thing called the Conservative Research Group, which has a pretty tough view on, you know, how China is a particular problem. So, I mean, I think we have to really, with all of this, I guess, you know, just sort of everything is now, I think, going to move to the sort of economic domain. You know, we've had the pandemic, and hopefully that is starting to be manageable, although I'm sure it will be in one form or another here for a long, long time. But now it's all about, you know, increasingly about the economics. And on that battlefield, you know, China is going to be much more, you know, kind of important. And I don't know what it does to the UK when, you know, you've got a kind of very, very difficult economic situation, but you also still want to carry on criticizing and attacking China, you know, and having problems with China. I mean, at some point, there's got to be kind of you know, there's a tension between those. At the moment, though, it seems that we are trying to do both at the same time, you know, say we're going to, you know, have kind of some sort of trading relations with China, but also quite tough political relations. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. I have here a message from Cliff Goldstein. What would be the first recommendation to a new American administration? And since Cliff didn't address it to one of the speakers, so I will address it to Tatiana. Please, what will be your first advice for the new American recommendation to a new American administration? After that, we will have David Nordell and Svibisk. Tatiana, are you with us?
Yeah, sure.
Yes,
Hello.
yes.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm not sure if I'm the best person to do any recommendations to the US. I would hope, as also an American continent country, that we could have have reestablished constructive broad dialogue between the US and China. I think we are aware that a lot has changed, and there is a broad consensus in the US with regard to many questions regarding China. So I'm not really considering that the change in position has been only only led by President Trump. So, but in case that there is a new administration, we would hope, and especially in the aftermath of such health, but also very strong, stark economic crisis, we could try to rebuild in a way our commitment to multilateral institutions, and then try to have them work towards our aim of coordinating global action. So we could agree in many sense that there is a lot to be done, revitalized, changed. So let's do that. Let's try to coordinate and to talk and revitalize this along different but constructive lines.
Thank you, Tatiana. And I would like to address the same question also to Caris regarding the recommendation to the old new or new American administration, please.
And just give it a little more focus, I think. In general, it's important for the countries that consider themselves allies of the US, shared values, to really come together and show their commitment to the democracy and rule of law and freedom of speech and the range of values that we take very seriously, because there might be a sense that there's an erosion of commitment to a value-oriented global order. And if the allies do come together and see eye to eye on these things which are central to our day-to-day life and our vision for our future and our children, I think that it will create a kind of foundation of unity that will speak 1,000 words, as they say.
Okay, thank you very much, Caris. Now we have a hand from David Nordell. David Nordell, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. The question is addressed mainly to Kerry, but also to, I suppose, to Caris. I work mainly in the field of maritime strategy and security, not necessarily naval, more civilian. And China has been a massive investor in a maritime transportation and infrastructure, particularly ports, over the last few years, not only in Ashdod and Haifa, but actually all over Europe. The most famous case is Piraeus, but actually there are plenty of other major European ports with Chinese investments. And then there are also major Chinese investments in places like Djibouti, which is actually also a military port for all intents and purposes. Hambantota, which has turned into effectively economic blackmail against Sri Lanka's government. There's a serious risk of the same thing happening with the port of Mombasa in Kenya. And we're talking about the most important critical infrastructure in the world, which is a maritime trade. Given that there's obviously a certain amount of anti-Chinese sentiment, not only in the USA, actually around the world. Kerry, you described this happening in Britain. I think that is also happening, perhaps to a smaller extent, within the EU. How do you see the most appropriate way for the United States in particular to look at Chinese infrastructure investments and try to influence the policies of host countries that are interested in increasing these infrastructure investments, or perhaps in some cases, finding a way to get out of these investments. I'm talking in particular about Sri Lanka and Kenya. What do you think is going to be the right way? We cannot cut off China because China is actually the biggest shipping nation in the world in terms of volumes. But at the same time, there are serious risks involved, and these include, of course, what has been said about Chinese investment in the port of Haifa vis-a-vis espionage on U.S. interests. What's the right thing, the right way to handle it?
Thank you very much, David. We need to keep the question short. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Yes, Carrie, if you can please refer to that.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think what is likely to happen as a result of COVID-19 and the world that we go into is, those that embrace and are keen on China are going to remain, kind of keen on China and embrace China, like Pakistan, for instance. And the skeptics who kind of were a little bit resistant, to the Belt and Road Initiative, which has involved a lot of these ideas of ports and debt diplomacy, are going to become much more kind of opponents. Like India, for instance, is very skeptical. I think it's going to be an opponent. So I don't think so. What that really means is, I think for the believers, and they're probably a considerable number, America can't really do much, because unless it's going to come along and have economic solutions, and its economy is obviously going to be really badly hit, badly hit by COVID. Its message is not that compelling. I mean, this is led by the economics. So for the believers, I don't think this will make much of a difference. For the skeptics, I suppose, then somehow something has got to be given to them where they're not forced to work with China if they don't want to. And that's the interesting question. Just to sort of like finally, COVID-19 is really deepening boundaries. People have been asking about, decoupling and stuff like this. And I suppose in a sense that makes the problem a bit easier. We know the kind of issue we're dealing with, but it also means that there are limitations to what people can do in countering China in certain places, because it's still got the capacity to do things, and the things it's going to be doing because of the economic situation will probably be more compelling because people need them more. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Carrie, do you want to take that as well?
One word, and to add, we can remember the case of Myanmar, where the U.S. sent some experts, I think lawyers, to renegotiate the contract and brought it down by 70%, dealing in billions. So the U.S. has a lot to contribute in the area dealing with enjoying Chinese investment for their infrastructure, and be it maritime or whatever.
All right. Thank you, Caris. We will take another question from the hands that we have here, and then we will go to the questions inside the chat, because the questions there. So, Svibisk, please, the floor is yours now.
Yes, do you hear me?
And please address the question to one of our
This is a
speakers.
question to Kerry Brown. How much do historical resentments and historical memory of China regarding the West affect their policy, and maybe even self-justify their manipulations and seeing the West as being hypocritical? I'm thinking of Great Britain, especially the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion, and the United States betraying them in Chinese eyes after World War I, turning the German areas of economic interest over to the Japanese, which was pretty stupid in retrospect, but that's a whole different question. And how might that affect Great Britain's ambitions to trade with China, especially since the EU in general is more of interest to China? Thank you.
Carrie, please.
Great, yeah, thank you. I mean, so for sure, I mean, China's got a strong historic memory. It's I think in the words of Lee Kuan Yew, he said the problem in Asia was that Japan never remembers and China never forgets. So it's sort of, kind of got a strong memory. About the UK, though, I think it's not really the history that is the issue. It is the fact that China is winning, right? I mean, and I think it's not about kind of it getting back on what happened in the past. I think Chinese nationalism, which is really what the Xi Jinping era is about, a lot of this nationalism, is because China now has this great resource, its economy, which gives it a kind of power that it's never had before. And that's not about getting even with people. It's just that China is winning. And the specific issue of the UK, kind of one of the things that's been interesting in the last few weeks is the idea of Britain and America asking for compensation from China. Right? So I find that very comical because A, it's not going to happen, and B, it kind of scratches this historic memory of reparations in the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. It seems to me a more kind of rational approach will be knowing that there's a common economic problem across the globe now. And it's probably in a situation like this that China is likely to want to engage with a player like the UK for its own ends. But as long as the UK goes and says, well, we need to also get something this in terms of access to services and other areas, well, that's possible. You can get sort of reparations in inverted commas that way, but you're not going to get China writing a check about this. And I mean, Xi Jinping yesterday said about 1.6 billion to the world for sort of helping. Well, that's not going to go very far.
Right. Thank you very much, Kerry. We'll take now a few questions from the chat. So we have the first, we have a question on decoupling that you mentioned right now, Kerry. Shalom Sherman asks, is decoupling a serious danger? And there is a second question, we will take two together to perhaps allow more questions and answers till the end of our discussion. Benjamin Pogosyan asks, greeting to all from Armenia. Do you believe some sort of US-Russia deal is possible where US de facto recognizes the post-Soviet space as a Russian sphere of influence, while Russia in return agrees to balance its relations with China? Let me address this question because there was no address here. Let me address it to Andrew, if it's okay with you, Andrew.
On the decoupling question, I mean, there is already decoupling underway in a number of sectors between the United States and China, certainly in a number of high technology sectors. I mean, the shifts to the export control and investment screening and a whole series of other measures that go beyond what's taking place formally here, FBI investigation. I mean, there's a whole slew of measures that are leading to forms of decoupling, and you see that in the financial flows, and that's not even addressing the kind of pure trade question. So there is a degree of decoupling taking place on the US-China side already. The question is how comprehensive it is. There are measures being looked at on the financial side, for instance, at the moment that would go much further. But that's just on the US-China side. I think one of the questions that's there at the moment is how far do you have other economies deliberately looking to take measures to reduce their level of dependency, either in supply chains or trade terms, on China. I think there's a bigger concern about this kind of single point of failure in the system as a result of what happened, not necessarily just with the pandemic itself, but what happened to supply chains when China shut down. Japan has put money behind moving encouraging some of its companies to move facilities out of China. There's resources being considered on the US side as well. It's something that's being looked at on the European front. This doesn't necessarily mean a kind of bifurcated economy. There's a kind of even more globalized I mean, the language being used on the European side is about diversification rather than a kind of repatriation or something. You look to build up other supply sources elsewhere. You channel additional resources into that. You sign additional FTAs. And this this needn't take place with pure reference to the US and China. I mean, this is as much around other Asian partners and other partners in Europe's neighborhood. But there is certainly a push to kind of rebalance the model of globalization. I think that's happening. I think the question is how far the scope of that goes, how long it takes, who's prepared to kind of smooth the path, what decisions businesses take of their own volition, and they are taking decisions to kind of, if you can't move your IP between the US and China in certain sectors now, you have to kind of split some of your operations. So I think a lot of this is underway. The question is just how far it goes.
All right, thank you, Andrew. And now a question and remark from Reuven Mirhav. Reuven, are you here?
Yeah.
Okay, please. And then Eli Carmon.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Caris, thank you for bringing me here. I owe you a lot. I have been dealing with China for a while, and I learned a few things from some old, as they say, old China oil, old China health. And one of the first things was to plant the tree together and eat the fruit together. This is a very basic Chinese maxim, and they believe in it very strongly. Now, I'm not a defender of China. They don't need my defense. But I remember back in the 70s, 60s, 70s, last century, when they were finishing the railway between Angola and Zambia and Tanzania, the Tanzam. In the West, especially the British, said, oh, these Chinese, they come, they will settle, they will colonize Africa and so on. A day after the railway was finished, the Chinese came, embarked on the huge ships and vanished from the face of East Africa. Of course, times have changed, and they know when they come to some place, what will they do? Will they take the tunnel with them? They work very hard and they finish the job and they want the money, and that's what they do. And in this Chinese complex, Chinese Western US complex, there is a lot of fake news. And there is a big panda in the room, a big elephant in the room. People are telling stories, and then there are lots of lies about scientific experiments which were made together in Wuhan with the Americans and with certain American medical firms and so on. People just don't have to get used to the fact that China is no more the trapped poor country with which they can do what they like. They have to recognize by using the very simple principle of political psychology that times have changed, and to deal with China at face value. And and that's the way to success, because it's a question of supply and demand. And Chinese don't realize why they can't build a port somewhere when before all these Westerns built ports wherever they could in China. So sometimes we make complicate things very complicated, but they are very simple. At the same time, we must find practical solutions and work together. And let's not forget one thing. Among those who operate or promulgate against China in the United States, there are lots of firms who are afraid of competition. I remember one example when Boeing was launching a very hard attack against the Israeli aircraft industries because they didn't want us to sell something. And we were stupid at that time not to go to coordinate it in advance with the US government. But nobody is innocent, and certainly not the Americans. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much for this, Reuven. Now we'll go to Eli Carmon. Eli, hello.
Yes. Hello, everybody, including some friends and colleagues, including Carrie Brown. I have a comment and a question. The comment is that I think that the Israeli media has spoken mainly about the American pressure on Israel because of the Chinese investments. But I think there are quite a lot of Israeli experts in strategy which are also extremely worried by the direction of such investment, especially in the issue of naval infrastructure, big harbors. And Caris, I think she mentioned that on the political level, China is always against Israel in spite of the very close commercial and cultural relations, and even is a strategic ally of Iran. we forget that not only on the issue of oil, but also militarily, there is a strategic relationship between China and Iran. And just last year, there were common naval drills in the, I think in the Gulf, together with the Russian Navy, by the way, Iranian,
Indian
Chinese,
Ocean.
and Russian Navy. So I think we should be worried if they are, on the one hand, investing in Haifa and Ashdod, and at the same time they are drilling with the Iranian Navy. My question is to remark by Caris that they have a presence, a military presence in Syria in order to monitor the Uyghurs. From what I know, I think 2-3 years ago, they asked to send 5,000 soldiers to Syria, and the Bashar regime did not agree. I think that the Russians also did not were very happy about it. So I want to know, indeed, if there is such a force, or how many Chinese troops are in Syria and where they are stationed, because we know that in the Idlib region, indeed, there are some 1,000 perhaps Uyghur jihadist fighters.
All right, thank you. Eli, Caris, this one is for you.
So the location of the troops is generally in Aleppo, as far as I understand, and there have been a movement of troops very in stages. The Syrian ambassador, sorry, the Chinese ambassador to Syria talked about bringing troops there, the recent former ambassador Qi Tianjin. And in fact, there's been a growing cooperation between Assad and China, where Assad purchased Hikvision cameras, and the Russians were very frustrated to learn later that those could remotely be turned into listening devices. So I think that it's through the Assad cooperation that they have been entering. And the Russian perspective is, I think we had a question earlier about Russia, is that being the little brother of China at this point, the Chinese are able to make moves quietly on the ground that they would not necessarily be able to do otherwise.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you, Caris. Igal Maor asked questions directed at Dr. Filippo Fasulo. How can you explain the underestimation of the Italian MOU, as said while looking at the Chinese high consideration of the Italian ports as gateways to South and Eastern Europe, including the significant cooperation and involvement of the Italian railways? So in the GBEC, Greece-Balkan Economic Corridor, from Piraeus into Europe. Felipe, please.
Thanks, and thanks for your question. Actually, to my understanding, there was an overestimation. So what the Italian government thought is to take economic gain from MOU without paying any political cost. What happened was exactly the opposite. Italy paid a very high political cost. That's the reason why I'm here is because everybody is talking about Italy maybe moving from a US side to China side, but without taking any real economic gain. And if you want to look at the other part of your question, so what about the ports? We should maybe phrase the question in a different point of view. So not if is in Chinese interest to take a stake or share of Italian ports, but is in Italian interest to improve infrastructure, to a better maritime infrastructure in northern Mediterranean. That's the point, even because we have to look at what happened with Suez Canal. And so there are figures who say that in the last 10 years, maybe traffic double or treble according to different figures, even more. So the point is that talking about Chinese role in Italian port is a very long story in Italy. So any politician in the last 10 to 15 years used to talk about we need to take advantage of our geographical location and to become the main location for Asian and Chinese trade towards Europe. So it is in Europe, in Italian interest. The point is how to do that. And right now we pay the cost of saying maybe Italy want to sell part of this territory to China while not actually getting any economic gain in reality.
Thank you, Felipe. And now we have a question from China. If you allow me, I will address it to Kerry. Is this a second Cold War of US or a sheer irresponsible way of giving statements against China by President Trump and his administration? That this comes from Ali, Zhenjiao University. I hope I spelled it right. I speak Arabic and Russian, not yet Chinese. I will improve it, of course. For now, this is a question for Kerry, please.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think the war of words between particularly President Trump and then his Secretary of State, and also the wolf warriors, as we call them, at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in particular, and you know, kind of Zhao Lijian, people like this. I mean, it's been kind of quite brutal. But does it mean that's a war of words, right? I mean, it's clearly a war of words and a war of rhetoric. In action, of course, discussions take on. The US is still talking to the Chinese about, you know, what to do about the kind of second stage of the trade negotiations. I don't think it's a Cold War. I think it's more complex than that. The problem with what we're moving into is not a bipolar world, but a dual track world. You know, I mean, I think the USSR and China, the USSR and America, there were far neater boundaries in a way. And you know, like the USSR was a kind of easier to understand enemy in some ways, because it was ideologically opposed and, you know, kind of had its own particular sort of area around it, you know, behind the Iron Curtain. And, you know, it was much more tangible. The problem, I suppose, with China is that it's part of the capitalist world in terms of investment flows, finance flows, and, you know, kind of supply flows. It practices capitalism, but in a very hybrid and very unique way. And that makes it more difficult. So I think it would be a massive misunderstanding of the challenge that we're facing to see this as a Cold War. That makes it way too easy. We're seeing a kind of new strategic conflict for sure, but it's not going to be resolvable in the way that the Cold War was. And I think it's very dangerous to think, you know, with the Cold War, of course, America and its allies were the winners. And we, you know, we're kind of hoping, you know, in this new Cold War that people are talking about, it'll be a rematch where we'll win again. But I don't think it's going to be like that at all. This is a much more complex issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry. And now we have two more questions from Shalom Sherman. One is per se, it's about pressure on Israeli universities not to cooperate with Chinese university. Should Israel reject this pressure? And the second one is about the US withdrawal from the Middle East. The Middle East policy of China, will it change in the coming years? And my question that I also wanted to address regarding that, if the share of China in global economy will shrink due to what is happening right now with the pandemia and possible, you know, US sanctions, more pressure, will it mean that China will inevitably become more involved in the Middle East here, specifically with Syria, perhaps the reconstruction of Syria, which is being avoiding for now? And let me start perhaps with Caris, and then we will also address it to other speakers, please.
So China in the Middle East is going to increase its presence regardless of the level of economic problems that it's facing because of the pandemic. China's presence is continuing to grow, and there are a few reasons for that. And it goes way beyond oil. In addition to the markets that are here, for example, the UAE is a distribution hub. It's a maritime global distribution hub. We also know that the Belt and Road Initiative goes across Central Asia and through the Middle East, and one of the roads takes you right through Iran. The maritime comes up the Suez Canal. There's a lot of discussion about China being interested in constructing the rail between Eilat and the Ashdod port, so that in case, you know, as a backup and alternative, you can take the goods off of the ships in Eilat and put them on a train and pick them up again on a ship in Ashdod. So we're going to see increasing presence of China in the Middle East, and we have an incredible lack of capacity across the Middle East in dealing with that. China has never been an area of expertise for Middle East scholars. And you know, even in Israel, we see very limited capacity. So I think across the board, the entire Middle East is going to have to really get a quick education.
All right, so we still have a few more minutes. I would like to ask for each of our speakers to give a short prognosis about things that we discussed during this session right now, and also try to be a prophet for a second and to see what you are waiting for to happen in the sphere of relations Israel, US, Middle East, Europe, China. A sentence or two for each one, not more than 1 minute, please. So Kerry, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Felipe, Tatiana, and Andrew.
Great, thank you. Very simple. The battleground is now increasingly going to be in the economy. And if China can actually re-energize and restore its economy to some kind of growth, and it does it in a way which is, more effective and quicker than the United States and Europe, then that is going to fundamentally change everything. And now, of course, it's got huge challenges. Someone said, maybe its economy will shrink. But I mean, we're looking at absolute catastrophe in Europe and America. And I mean, if China can prove that it is able to deal with its economic issues and gets to growth quicker than others, well, we can no longer sneer at, socialism with Chinese characteristics, even if we don't particularly like it. That's the absolutely core and key issue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Felipe.
To my understanding, I can see increasing competition for Europe. And the main battleground, as Kerry and Andrew said, it will be industry. Industry is going to be the most relevant topic for European politics, and redefining industrial relation between Europe and China will be the main topic, not only for China specialists, but the main topic for European Union and manufacturing powerhouse like Germany, France, and Italy. So who is doing what and where is going to be the most important question for the near future.
Okay, Tatiana, please. Tatiana.
Yeah. Well, I think as I tried to show in my initial remarks, the tremendous importance of flow, especially of Brazilian exports to China, are crucial for us in the short term. I think we are seeing it will be a much more volatile world. We hope that in the aftermath of the crisis, we could see more cooperation. I think this will be very difficult, but I think it would be very important for us, both from the part of US, but also from the part of China, that we can have genuinely coordinated cooperation. And here I can talk one sentence about the BRI. Brazil has been one of the largest recipients of infrastructure investments from China, and we are not part of the BRI. And then we need another webinar to discuss that. But I think we could, if we can translate this sort of the intention, in the part of China of contributing, to the world through the trade and investment, and also really establish a constructive dialogue, I think this would be the most important for us.
Okay, and now Andrew, please also address the question. We have the last moment question from Jonathan. Why is there this common perception that China is Europe's path to profitability when they will likely be Europe's largest industrial competitor? Please.
I mean, I think that's been the shift in views that's really taken place, which is why I referenced the BDI paper in the first instance. I mean, there is an understanding that China is its largest industrial competitor. You saw, I mean, the press conference and the statement from Macron and Merkel yesterday are really worth kind of looking at to see where the kind of thinking on some of these questions is at now. There was a really extensive section that's not even in the paper talking about the need to build up European champions, the need to adjust European competition policy, that it's been too kind of naive and Europe-centric. There's a whole series of these areas. I think that the sense that that Europe has been too open, that there hasn't been sufficient attention on these industrial policy questions, on defensive measures. Yes, there is going to be, as Kerry suggested, a kind of immediate economic need. If you're Volkswagen, you're hitting your sales this year that you were still hitting last year in China, because China has recovered already more quickly than other economies. There is a really immediate impact on that, and there are certain sectors that are going to have and will continue to have real interest in this huge market. I think there's been a big revisiting of the kind of the fundamentals in Europe on these questions, and I think there's a big concern to not just repeat what happened after the sovereign debt crisis in terms of Chinese access to strategic assets in Europe, in terms of a recovery that just builds even more dependence on China, given China's willingness to kind of weaponize or instrumentalize this against European interests. I just think we're in a very, very different landscape as a result of all this. And there's certainly debates still underway in terms of where the balance of this comes out, but I don't think as a result of the pandemic and as a result of exactly what was posed in the question, the sense that China is already becoming Europe's leading industrial competitor, that we're going to get the same kind of approach that we've seen in the past.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And Caris, the absolutely last question for you from Avinom Idan. Do you expect to see in the future the Chinese army follows part of the Chinese ports along the BRI, as we see in the case of Djibouti? And then I would like to ask you, as a host of this fascinating event, to wrap up the discussion.
Thank you so much, Ksenia. Well, Avinom, I would say that in a word, the answer is yes. When I was giving a talk to 50 People's Liberation Army officers last November in the end of the Beijing Xiangshan Forum in Beijing, I was asked to talk about security for the BRI, and I don't have a military expertise, so I was talking about all other areas of security. And the fact that there is no military framework for the PLA to be taken care of, worrying about dealing with China's interests across the BRI around the world. And in the break, a number of officers came up to me and said, we really are so frustrated because we know we need to have military presence. We're not allowed to talk about it, but it's going to be very important. We need to be there. So I think that indicates the trend, and it's certainly a natural trend. Which is why I think it's very important for Israel to be paying closer and closer attention to Chinese developments in the Middle East. And I want to just address your other excellent question about a kind of prognosis. I agree with Carrie in the short term, and I agree with Andrew in the medium term, but I really hope that there can be a rethink, and I know this might be a little bit idealistic, but a rethink on the underpinnings of our economic policies. We set after the Industrial Revolution, that technology has defined the demographic approach to our economy. And we're now in the 21st century with a whole totally new set of technologies that don't require the massive amount of human resources working in the factory, for example. So I think it would be incumbent upon all of us, due to Corona, to start to rethink and really impose some creativity into how we're looking at the global economy. And ideally, there would be cooperation, as Tatiana said, on both sides, between the US and China. And I think that both countries are going to welcome ways of cooperating that don't lose face, at least in the beginning. None of us want to see the outcome of what an increased tension might lead to. Israel is already not enjoying this experience. And I think another factor that's critical is the issue of excellence. The US was very successful and seen as a model until the 2008 subprime meltdown. And that is really what caused the Chinese to say, maybe our way is better, because look what they did. So the US is going to have to invest in R&D, invest in its people, raise the excellence of the country in education, et cetera, if it wants to compete, because China is here to stay. And from my perspective, I think we want to be working with everybody. I want to thank all of you. This has been a fantastic experience for us. We really appreciate so many of you coming and giving your views and asking questions. To the speakers, many thanks. You have been absolutely outstanding. And my big hugs to Ksenia, who has led an absolutely wonderful Zoom seminar. Thank you so much.